Tonight we have Brian Schroeder, who's going to speak to us on God of the Gaps. And so with no further ado, I'll let Brian take over from here.
Thank you, Kevin.
I was going to mention,
In olden days, when cartographers drew maps, particularly maps of parts of the world that they didn't know that had not yet been explored, places like deepest, darkest Africa, or possibly the Great Southland that had been, well, they kind of done a bit of drawing around some of the edges, but they really didn't know much more about it. They were thought to draw dragons in those places, add the text, "There be dragons." But as explorers explored and mapped, there became less and less space for dragons to hide, until now there is virtually nowhere left for them. Similarly, for life, the universe and everything, we could see and work out some things, but so very much was not known, not understood. So God became our explanation. But as we learn more and more, discover more and more, so the spaces for God became smaller and fewer, until eventually there will be nowhere for him, and he will cease to exist. Now, this website, rationalwiki.org, has got a page on God of the Gaps, and this is a small excerpt from that page. And it provides quite a good summary of the issue from a non-theistic or atheistic perspective. And as it says here, God of the Gaps, or a divine fallacy, is a logical fallacy that occurs when believers invoke "God did it," or a variant, in order to account for some natural phenomena.
this is Brian.
Science cannot at the time of the argument explain.
See what it is? I don't have video going.
This concept resembles what systems theorists refer to as an explanatory principle. God of the Gaps is a bad argument, not only on logical grounds, but on empirical grounds. There is a long history of gaps being filled, and the remaining gaps for God are thus getting smaller and smaller, suggesting we don't know yet as an alternative that works better in practice. Naturalistic explanations of still mysterious phenomena always remain possible, especially in the future where research may uncover more information. Invoking a God of the Gaps is a did-it fallacy and an ad hoc fallacy as well, as an argument from incredulity or an argument from ignorance, and is thus an informal fallacy. And so it's kind of like some of these pictures we have here where we've got two cogs on one side, the first one turns the second one, the second one turns the third one, and the third one turns the fourth one. But between 2 and 3, well, we don't know how they connect. So, well, just insert God here. It is God who does the connection from one side to the other. Or, as with this cartoon by Sidney Harris, you got the equation on one side, which leads through to the equation on the other side. But how you get from one side to the other, well, we've got no idea. So we put in a miracle. And as the critic says here, I think you should be more explicit in step 2. Neil deGrasse Tyson wrote, "If that's how you want to invoke your evidence for God, then God is an ever-receding pocket of scientific ignorance that's getting smaller and smaller and smaller as time moves on. So just be ready for that to happen, if that's how you want to come at the problem." So that's simply the God of the Gaps argument. And if you were thinking that this whole concept is something that is newish because of modern science, well, maybe it's not so new after all. Hippocrates lived roughly 460 BC to 370 BC. And he wrote that people think that epilepsy is divine, simply because they don't have any idea what causes epilepsy. But I believe that someday we will understand what causes epilepsy. And at that moment, we will cease to believe that it is divine. And so it is with everything in the universe, which sounds almost like a very modern formulation. So that brings us to this cartoon here, where we've got this creature that looks a little bit like a cross between Julius Caesar and a stuffed teddy bear lying on the ground. You're God of the gaps. You betcha. You don't look so good. Well, ever since science came along, I'm not needed to explain earthquakes, diseases, or even why we're here. All I do now is explain how car keys get misplaced or why socks go missing in the dryer. But those American creationists still need me, thank God. And as Dara O'Brien wrote, just because science doesn't know everything doesn't mean you can fill in the gaps with whatever fairy tale most appeals to you. And note that most of those who use this argument against theists, accusing them of having a God of the gaps, always, or almost always, come from the presupposition that there is no God, that he is a figment of human imagination made up to fill gaps. However, such an a priori assumption is as unscientific as what they accuse theists of. The argument basically condenses down to, there is no God, therefore there is no God. Which of course is rather meaningless, but then the atheist will retort that this is no worse than saying God is, therefore God is. And of course, if it is merely a matter of human invention and intellectual creation, then that is actually a valid response. But the theist goes much deeper than that and claims that God is a God of revelation, that he has revealed himself at various times and in various ways, and continues to do so. He is not just a God we can intellectually imagine, but one we can experience, and whom many claim to have experienced. So in the same way, I do not postulate the existence of a wife to explain that I am married. So theists don't postulate the existence of God to explain life, the universe, and everything, to explain their experience of him. So, could it be simply a matter of believing what we want to believe? Many atheists would assert that, given the discoveries of science, there can be no other explanation for still believing in God. And theists similarly, for those who refuse to consider God, no matter what. Law professor Philip Johnson points out, the whole point of Darwinism is to show that there is no need for a supernatural creator, because nature can do the creating by itself. And Francisco Ayala, who was an evolutionary biologist and professor of biological sciences, ecology and evolutionary biology, and also one-time Dominican priest, but now a non-theist, wrote that Darwin's greatest accomplishment was to show that living beings can be explained as a result of natural processes, natural selection, without the need to resort to a creator or other external agent. So thus they display a strong bias towards believing in not God, because that's what they want to believe, and seeking reasons to justify that belief. Interestingly, those atheists who loudly proclaim the foolishness of believing in a God of the gaps do so on the basis of their belief and faith in science of the gaps, or more accurately, a future science of the gaps. One day, science will work this out. This despite knowing that absolute knowledge of everything is impossible. Which then brings us to this cartoon again with a slight modification. We have on the one side part of the equation, we have on the other side the other part, and then something natural occurs in between to get from one side to the other. And the critic's point is just as valid now as it was before. I think you should be more specific here in step 2. Naturalism of the gaps is just as fallacious as God of the gaps. It has been shown that some things are genuinely unknowable. Consider, for example, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. At a quantum level, knowledge is fuzzy. For example, position and momentum. The better we know one, the less we know the other. And so if we know a particle's position absolutely, then we can know nothing about its momentum. Or Gödel's incompleteness theorem. There are some arithmetic statements that can be neither proven nor disproven. And arithmetic means it's not some esoteric branch of mathematics, but more of the central parts of mathematics. Or Turing's halting problem. You may know of Alan Turing from his work on the Enigma code in World War II to decode the Germans' secret codes. He proved that there are some computational problems, that is, problems that are capable of being worked out by a computer, which we cannot predict whether or not it will finish in finite time. And these are just for starters. Joseph Straub, who was Professor of Computer Science at Columbia University and author or editor of around 120 papers in computer science, mathematics, physics, finance, and economics, wrote that Ralph Gomery, the president of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, proposes a tripartite division of science: the known, the unknown, and the unknowable. The known is taught in the schools and universities and is exhibited in the science museums. But scientists are excited by the unknown. Or if you think about it, that's kind of the Star Trek principle. Space, the final frontier, to boldly go where no man has gone before. And so you can quite understand why the sort of person who would get into science will be the sort of person who would be excited by the unknown. Gomery's tripart division proposes three distinct areas: the known, the unknown, which someday may become known, and the unknowable, which will never be known. The unknown and the unknowable form the boundary of science. And John Barrow wrote more about this in his book, Impossibility, The Limits of Science and the Science of Limits, stating that there are things that are ultimately unknowable, undoable, or unreachable. One of the problems of science is that it shows us that the more we know we don't know. That is, more than just filling gaps in our knowledge, it also illuminates the fact there is much more to be known than we previously thought. Our perception of what is there to be learned is an expanding universe. Kind of like science, you walk into a darkened room through an open door and you shine light into that room, only to discover that leading off of that room are yet more doors leading into more darkened rooms. Thus, there will always be at least pockets of unknown. So does this mean we have saved God? Not at all. Any God who only exists in our unknown pockets, in our ignorance, is no God at all. Last year, I spoke at Reasonable Faith on the Christian roots of modern science. I showed that the fathers of modern science, people like Newton, Kepler, Copernicus, Hooke, Pascal, Kelvin, and many more, were not trying to fill in the gaps so as to leave no room for God, but more to fill in the gaps to paint a clearer picture of him, to think God's thoughts after him, as one said, to gain understanding of what God has done, what he has put there for us. They viewed it more like a jigsaw puzzle. The more pieces we can put in, the fuller and better picture we can get, and get of God himself. Science for them did not exclude God and paint him out of existence, but rather revealed him more and more and exposed his greatness more and more. And so just a few quotes from that talk. Francis Bacon is called the founder of the scientific method and the father of empiricism. And he wrote, "For our Saviour saith, you err not knowing the scriptures nor the power of God, laying before us 2 books or volumes to study. If we will be secured from error, first the scriptures revealing the will of God, and then the creatures, natural science, expressing his power, whereof the latter is a key unto the former, not only opening our understanding to conceive the true sense of the scriptures, other general notions of reason and rules of speech, but chiefly opening our belief and drawing us into a due meditation of the omnipotency of God, which is chiefly signed and engraven upon his works. Galileo wrote that God is known by nature in his works and by doctrine in his revealed word. And his conflict was not with the Bible or Christianity, but with the Aristotelian basis of the science of his day. Isaac Newton is still widely regarded as one of the greatest scientists of all time. He's also regarded as one of the greatest mathematicians of all time. And he wrote, "The opposite to godliness is atheism in profession and idolatry in practice. Atheism is so senseless and odious to mankind that it never had many professors. Atheism is so senseless. When I look at the solar system, I see the Earth at the right distance from the sun to receive the proper amounts of heat and light. This did not happen by chance." And that last point there is kind of a precursor to what is now called the fine-tuning problem. And Stephen White spoke on that at the very last meeting at Reasonable Faith, just the fine-tuning of the universe. And there is so much more that we know now that Newton did not know then, which amplified what he was trying to get at. Kepler. Johannes Kepler was an astronomer and the author of the laws of planetary motion. And it was him who coined that phrase of thinking God's thoughts after him. And he also wrote that the chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order and harmony that has been imposed on it by God, which he revealed to us in the study of mathematics. Louie Pasteur is called the father of microbiology. Among many other things, he disproved the belief in spontaneous generation. Non-living matter does not, cannot become living beings. Only life produces life. And his son-in-law later wrote about him that absolute faith in God and in eternity, and a conviction that the power for good given to us in this world will be continued beyond it, were feelings which pervaded his whole life. Carl Linnaeus is called the father of modern taxonomy, the naming and classifying of all living entities. And even today, we use his system in classifying all living entities. And he wrote that the study of nature would reveal the divine order of God's creation. And it was the naturalist's task to construct a natural classification, reveal this order in the universe. And there is so very much more that I could go into. And all of this, not to mention people like Blaise Pascal, mathematician, physicist, and religious philosopher, who laid the foundation for the modern theory of probabilities. René Descartes, philosopher, mathematician, and scientist, one of the key figures of the scientific revolution. He was the one who coined the phrase, "I think, therefore I am." And also we get Cartesian coordinates named after him. Gregor Mendel, and you can see from his picture there that he did a few other things besides science. And his principles of inheritance form the cornerstone of modern genetics. Anthony van Leeuwenhoek is called the father of microbiology, and he was the first to observe bacteria and protozoa. Gottfried Leibniz was called the last universal genius. Mathematician, physicist, philosopher, theologian, he was into everything and was, well, first rate at everything. William Thomson, or Lord Kelvin, wasn't always quite as old as he looks in that picture. But he was responsible for the formulation of the first and second laws of thermodynamics. Or Michael Faraday, who developed the principles underlying electromagnetic induction and electrolysis, among many other things. And it's his work that has resulted in giving us the electric motor, among other things too. James Joule worked on the nature of heat and light and the relationship to mechanical work, and laid the foundation for the theory of conservation of energy. And James Clerk Maxwell is most famous for his theory of electromagnetism. And there are just so many more. Virtually all the great names in the history of the development of modern science are Christian. Most of them are devout in their Christianity and encouraged in their scientific endeavours by their beliefs and underlying belief system. Early scientists, as Bacon said, considered that God has given us two books from which we can learn about him, the Bible and nature. Thus, studying both teaches us more about God. The more we know about both the Bible and the universe, the more we know about God. He wasn't God of the gaps, but God of the non-gaps. In seeking to think God's thoughts after him, they did not believe they were exposing not God, but the exact opposite. They believed that the more they discovered, the more they learned, the more they would reveal and see God. Thus, the more we learn about the universe and how it works, the greater we understand to be one who designed and made it. It isn't just early scientists who thought that way. Robin Collins says, "I see physics as uncovering the evidence of God's fingerprint at a deeper and more subtle level than the ancients could have dreamed of. He has used physics to enable me to see the evidence of his presence and creative ability." And Robin Collins has PhDs in physics and philosophy and is currently Professor of Philosophy and is a prominent advocate in the philosophy of the fine-tuning argument. If we look at something, the computer, the table, we see it. When we examine it more closely and learn more and more what it does, how it works, how it was put together, we don't see that as removing room for a designer and builder. Rather, we see more and better the skill, ability, and knowledge that went into making it. Alan Sandage was an astronomer, and he was the one who determined the first reasonably accurate values of the Hubble constant. And he worked closely with Edwin Hubble and in quite a few of the very important things in that area. And he wrote that many scientists are now driven to faith by their very work. And based on what I read, he was one of those. Henry Drummond was a Scottish evangelist and biologist, writer and lecturer who also studied physics and mathematics. And he wrote this in 1894. "There are reverent minds who ceaselessly scan the fields of nature and the books of science in search of gaps which they will fill up with God, as if God lived in the gaps. What view of nature or of truth is theirs, whose interest in science is not in what it can explain, but in what it cannot? Whose quest is ignorance, not knowledge? Whose daily dread is that the cloud may lift, and who, as darkness melts from this field or from that, begin to tremble for the place of his abode? What needs altering in such finely jealous souls is at once their view of nature and of God. Nature is God's writing and can only tell the truth. God is light, and in him is no darkness at all." And Henry Drummond is the one, it is believed, who first coined this term, God of the gaps. And he is a theist who believes very much in God, and he coined this term as a criticism of certain others who tried to find God in the gaps when he believed that God is to be found in the non-gaps. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German theologian who was involved in a plot to kill Hitler during World War II. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer is another one that we looked at earlier this year when Jeff Russell spoke to us about the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And after he was arrested and imprisoned on suspicion of being a part of this plot to kill Hitler, he wrote many letters and papers from prison which were smuggled out. And in one of them he wrote, "How wrong it is to use God as a stopgap for the incompleteness of our knowledge. If, in fact, the frontiers of knowledge are being pushed further and further back, that is bound to be the case, then God is being pushed back with them and is therefore continually in retreat. We are to find God in what we know, not in what we don't know." A belief in God in the gaps is very different to a belief in the God of the gaps. I think we would all agree that there are gaps, many gaps, some of them very large. Using the jigsaw puzzle analogy, what we have now, what we actually see, is actually much less than what we don't. Much like the postulated dark matter and dark energy in the universe. Theists believe that those gaps are explicable, that God is there, that pieces do exist to fill all gaps. Thus, if there is something we do not now know or understand, we believe that God does know and understand because he made it, just as he did for all of the things that we do now understand. We invoke God in the gaps because we see God in the non-gaps. And thus, like the early scientists, we consider that provides us good reason to search, study, investigate, and find that which we do not now have. Walter Bradley was Professor of Engineering at Baylor University, and he wrote, "It is quite easy to understand why so many scientists have changed their minds in the last 30 years, agreeing that the universe cannot reasonably be explained as a cosmic accident. Evidence for an intelligent designer becomes more compelling the more we understand about our carefully crafted habitat." And Paul Davies, the former professor of theoretical physics at the University of Adelaide, and I studied theoretical physics at the University of Adelaide. But unfortunately, my time there was before his and I missed him, so that was a little bit of a disappointment to me. And he wrote, "Through my scientific work, I have come to believe more and more strongly that the physical universe is put together with an ingenuity so astonishing that I cannot accept it merely as a brute fact. And again, I cannot believe that our existence in this universe is a mere quirk of fate, an accident of history, an incidental blip in the great cosmic drama. Or in other words, discoveries in science pointed to God when former ignorance took them the opposite way. The exact opposite of the God of the gaps theory. In other words, the fewer and smaller the gaps, the more of God." And so a summary of this, the God of the gaps is two things. One, it is the belief that God is what explains those things we can't explain or don't understand, and he is not involved where we can find a natural explanation. And two, it is the argument that the use of this concept exposes the absurdity of believing in the interventions of God in nature, and that this God of the gaps is who God is, and thus he can be readily disposed of and ridiculed. Now, I'm not sure of the source of this quote, this is just how I found it. Atheists often charge theists with an ad hoc fallacy of inserting God as the explanation for mysterious phenomena. This is a misrepresentation of natural theology, which argues from all that we do know of science. When the atheist claims that someday science will explain all of reality and confirm there is no God, he contradicts himself. For this is commission of an ad hoc fallacy, the argument from ignorance that can be dubbed the future science of the gaps fallacy. And while there are some theists who do see God in those terms, that God is more of a caricature than an accurate picture and is not the God of Christianity. Those who worship a God of the gaps search for him in the unknown. Christians search for him in the known and then extrapolate to the unknown. Like a jigsaw puzzle, God is not the backing board on which we put it together, a backing that steadily vanishes with every piece we manage to fit. Rather, God is the picture that grows ever clearer and more real with every piece we manage to fit and every gap that vanishes. And so that finally brings me to my obligatory Calvin and Hobbes cartoon, although just with Calvin this time. And so Calvin is out there with his watering can talking to the plants. So you want some water, huh? Well, I've got a big can of it here. It's up to me to decide whether you live or die. I control your fate. Your very lives are in my hands. Without me, you're as good as dead. Without me, you don't... So, is man the measure of all things? Or is there something more? This is where we stop for a supper break if we're going to have a supper break.
I better unmute myself.
Yep.
So, yeah, thank you very much, Brian. And so now is our virtual time where we have a supper break. It's a short supper break. It's ended now. And so we'll actually commence the third part of our meeting, which is the open discussion. So, Brian, do you mind just unsharing your screen so we kind of get a bit more expanded visual on all who are present? So feel free to unmute your microphone if you would like to speak. Now let's see, I had some comments myself. In your slide on Tyson, he was kind of inferring that the gaps are constantly getting smaller. I think that's actually a disputable statement, like in terms of the ability of naturalism to explain what we see has become actually more difficult in the face of the fine-tuning. So have you got any comment on that?
Well, in a sense, that's both right and wrong. As we discover more, then there's obviously less to discover. So therefore the gaps will be getting smaller. But as I also pointed out, the more that we discover, the more it exposes extra stuff that we don't know, so that we become more aware of the extent of our ignorance.
Yeah, but like with the fine-tuning, that's actually presenting a problem for the naturalists, because as we discover more of the fine-tuning, then it actually kind of makes it more difficult for them to explain. And theism seems to be a better explanation for it.
Well, that could be part of the reason why some of my later quotes from people who are suggesting that knowing more of this stuff, we're more inclined to believe in God, as we can see things like that.
Yeah, well, that's a kind of a positive thing, where the positive evidence, the things we do know, actually point to God rather than things we don't.
Yep. Well, that's what theists would claim.
I'll just hold the show for a bit. You, in an early slide, you actually mentioned about evidence that we derive from spiritual experience. So that seems to be kind of a non-scientific aspect. Are you saying the primary evidence you get for God is your experience, or can you actually get it from invoking science?
Well, we claim that God is outside of this universe and he created it. And if he is the creator, then he is not part of the universe. And anything that is not part of this universe cannot be subject to science. All science can do is infer from what we see of this universe, natural universe, that, well, you mentioned the fine-tuning argument, that there has to be something beyond random chance. The universe didn't make itself, that there are so many things that line up in a certain direction that point to the existence of God. But again, that is more, it's not scientific proof, it is more like legal proof or other forms of proof in that sense. So for example, there's no way that we can scientifically prove that I love my wife, or that you love yours for that matter. And there are many, many things in a court of law that are proven beyond reasonable doubt, that are not proved scientifically.
All right, open up to others.
Can I say something? I find it kind of quaint and almost antiquated that people would even consider using the God of the gaps theory to kind of explain God anymore. That is, I abandoned that many decades ago, and even I was late coming to the realization. it seems to me that to try and use science to explain God is a complete misuse of science. There is a role of science in elucidating some of the features of particularly of the Old Testament. There's a lot that can be said from a scientific point of view, but really, if we're trying to explain God, you don't turn to science. You do as God originally intended, which is go to the Bible. You explain God through the miracles, through the fulfilled prophecy, through the acting out in the Old Testament through the nation of Israel, the truths that become evident in the New Testament. That's where you go to find the reality of God. Science is kind of, for us anyway, in the 21st century, is a kind of afterthought, a useful afterthought, but it's not for proving God, it's for elucidating aspects of the Old Testament, so that we can understand things from a more informed and intelligent perspective. And that's where science comes in useful.
I think that's kind of the point of view that those early scientists were coming from as well. They had their Bible. They believed that revealed God. That was central to them. But then science was studying what God had done. So through study of science, we can then learn more about God. So for example, which they wouldn't have known, we consider quantum mechanics and electronics and all sorts of things like that. And we imagine God as sort of like an ancient type being, and an ancient type being could not possibly understand all of that sort of thing. And yet, if we understand the Bible and the scriptures correctly, then we understand that it was God who designed all of this in the first place, and therefore God understands quantum theory ever so much better than any of us ever could.
Quantum theory actually comes in, it's quite a long argument, but it comes in very handy for explaining how something can be random and divinely directed simultaneously. That to me explains quite a lot. You need quite a bit of time to unpack that, but yeah, that's the kind of thing where I find science helps in understanding the Bible and theology.
Gordon, could you explain how quantum mechanics invokes or is related to the divine?
I think I would need a bit of advance notice to think about that one.
Well, isn't that what you said?
I don't fully understand quantum mechanics, but I do see how things happening at the subatomic level can be both absolutely random and divinely appointed simultaneously.
So you were suggesting that something can be both a particle and a wave at the same time, is that it?
Not quite, but
I've got a question about kind of seeing kind of nature being the evidence of God. I was listening to something about kind of the difference between presuppositional apologetics and classical, or I'm not sure if it's called naturalist apologetics, where it's more of a natural approach to kind of coming to the conclusion of God. And whereas presuppositionalism was kind of beginning with God as a necessary starting point. Can you maybe make a comment on that?
Those were some big words.
Yeah.
Now at this stage, I don't think I could make a comment on that, sorry.
Okay.
That'd take a fair bit of thinking through, I think.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
I think the contrast is between presuppositional apologetics and classical, what's called classical apologetics.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you go like classical is arguing from scientific and historical evidence to God, whereas presuppositional starts by assuming the existence of God and seeing if you can make sense of what you see.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was just trying to, I was just kind of thinking of that kind of stuff when I was listening to this talk. Yeah.
I had a interesting conversation with a colleague who's an atheist, and this I suppose is probably in reference to what Gordon was talking about earlier, in that saying that we come to God through the Bible and proof of Christ and prophecies and things. Anyway, I've been having long discussions with my colleague, friend, for many years, discussing those types of things. But when I actually confronted him one day about what convinces him that there is a God, I sort of reversed the question. I said, what's the strongest argument for God for you? And he said, it's the fine-tuning argument. So that really threw me, and I sort of started looking into it from then. As a Christian who's been a Christian for more than 40 years, I thought, hey, there's something in this, because if an atheist can admit to me that he sees the science as being the compelling argument for God, I'm sure he wasn't necessarily pointing to Christianity at that point, but for an agent, then I thought there was something I should be looking into. So yeah, that changed my view on that led me to apologetics, actually, that one statement from him. Yeah, so we're still having ongoing argument discussions about God and his existence. Yeah, but yeah, anyway.
Of course, you can never actually prove God through science, but what you can do is you can look at the probability of our being here, the solar system being just right, all the settings being just right. Look at these statistics, and the more conditions you apply, more perfect conditions that we observe, the smaller and smaller the probability is that we got here by chance. And
that's right.
You can very quickly bring it down to a probability of 1 in quadrillions of trillions, and it just becomes impossible. You can't actually prove God, and there are other scientific arguments of a similar kind. You can look at the probability of a whole series of Exodus miracles, for example, which can be explained physically, but then they're occurring just in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, exactly in accordance with prayer of Moses or whoever. You look at the probability and it just becomes vanishingly small. So there are many sort of scientific arguments of this kind, but at the end of the day, the only way you're ever going to come to a satisfactory understanding of God is not through science, not through probability, but through personal experience.
No, well, that's right. But I think the science can lead people to God, and to the God of the Bible, basically, because he's a personal God, and the fine-tuning does point to a personal God. It doesn't point to a God that's non-caring or just spurted us into being. It points to someone that takes a deep interest in us. So it can bring you to discussions about Christ, because he's the most personable of the religious leaders.
There are a number of pagan creation myths that envisage creation as being an accidental byproduct of some sort of interaction between gods, and that does not work with fine-tuning either.
Hi everyone. Sorry, is it all right if I jumped in with a comment? How are you guys all going?
Good.
I just wanted to add to, I guess, what Bronwyn was saying as well. I mean, it reminded me of that Romans 1:20 passage that says about, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. So I think the Bible does sort of anticipate this idea that creation can, that we can sort of come to a conclusion of God's existence from looking at creation, which is essentially what science does, and to sort of touch on that legal idea, it's that idea that we all should be seeing the same evidence, and then people, I guess, come to their own conclusions. It's a little bit why we have, you know, in law, multiple judges to make a decision, you know, because you might have 3 judges who are looking at the exact same evidence, and 2 of them come to one conclusion, 1 comes to another. We just had a recent High Court decision, you know, that was sort of 7-0. But that's the reason for having multiple judges, is because it seems that within human nature, we could all be looking at the same thing and come to different conclusions.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking of that same sort of thing when Bronwyn and Gordon were speaking.
I think I really like Bronwyn's approach, because I think the audience here is not, you know, not 50-year-plus people who have been Christians and whose solid faith is already established, right? But actually the younger folks who are being persuaded quite readily of the conflict between science and religion. And yeah, I see a lot of them assuming that we believe in a God of the gaps. And they don't do a steel man argument, they do a straw man, and then they proceed to knock that straw man down, and then they convince each other and our kids and our grandkids that they've knocked off Christianity, and quite intelligently, and they feel quite smug. And I think this is a really important apologetic tool to actually make sure we don't get into that habit, and we recognise what other people are hearing.
My daughter started university this year. Last is her second year, and she can point to 3 different occasions where herself or a close friend, who are both Christians, have had professors stand up and make some derogatory remark about not Islam or Baha'i or Buddhists, but about Christianity and about God's existence. And they've even gone so far as to say that science has undoubtedly, solved the world's problems and God doesn't exist. They've said that from the platform. And what it highlighted to me was that I wished I'd known a lot more about this stuff earlier when my children were growing up, so I could have fed them a bit more. And although I've sort of said that now in their young adulthood, I think as a church, if we don't take opportunity and share with our youth, they're just going to get bombarded by it at uni, and yeah, they don't know how to respond. So
that's where I thought those quotes from Paul Davies were interesting. You get the impression that he came from that position originally, and now through his study of science and things like fine-tuning and all the rest, he is moving towards belief in God. I don't think he's actually there yet, but he's certainly moving in that direction.
He is, yeah.
I kind of bristle when I hear this idea that science has disproved God, science has disproved the Bible. Not at all. And when I see or hear someone in our community who says this, I tell people, and just send them to me, because I've been studying this for years. And it's not true. And
there's your answer, Bronwyn.
Hand them to Gordon.
I wanted to have a go myself at them.
Bronwyn, what university is that? Is that Adelaide?
Uni Adelaide Uni.
Okay,
yeah.
That's fine. You can tell them to point to their colleague, Dr. Paul Babby. He's a professor at the law school there, and he's an Eastern Catholic priest. He's got about 10 PhDs, and he's a Harvard professor as well. Very staunch Christian, who's one of their colleagues. So, and a lot smarter than probably whoever's teaching your daughter. I can tell you that. You don't want to mess with him. So it's Dr. Paul Babby, and he's on the staff there at Adelaide University. One of our Harvard professors who have come to Adelaide to teach master's level law.
Yeah.
Very devout Christian. So there you go.
If he's that smart, he's probably best avoided from their perspective.
Oh yeah, he'll eat them for breakfast. But at least they can have that discussion in the staff room. You know, your daughter could say, well, as I understand it, one of your esteemed colleagues is, you know, thinks very differently to you, Dr. Paul Babby. I'd love to hear his perspective on that. Why not?
Mm.
Brian, one of the things I put in the chat as you were showing all of the historical scientists and well aware of the the arguments that science could have only come from a culture that actually believed in a rational creator.
Yep.
But you're familiar with the skeptic knockoff of that. Of course, they were scientists because, you know, everybody. Of course, they were Christian because everybody was in their day.
Yeah.
If you weren't a Christian, you'd be excommunicated and kicked out. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So how do you sort of parlay or get into conversation about that one when that one comes up?
You can really only make that sort of claim from a distance without knowing what they really thought or what they really said. Take, for example, that quote I just gave from Newton earlier. He didn't have to say that.
No.
He volunteered that sort of information. Also consider that people, well, Isaac Newton in particular, wrote a whole lot more about theology than about science and mathematics combined. And there is just so much, if you study the lives of these people, that the idea that you are presenting with on behalf of these other people is nonsense in that sense, if you really know.
Do you find with younger people they can hear that or take that in, or is it just a hard argument to actually... I'm aware of that and it's hard, but do you find that's effective, or do you find them just sort of, yeah, that's not really effective argument, or at least engaging to them?
It depends a lot as to how much they really care about what is true and what is not, and how much they want to believe what they want to believe and too bad about the facts. If they really care about truth, then yeah, they would be interested.
Yeah, I think Brian's point is very good. Truth is actually is paramount here. I mean, Christianity is the truth. Jesus says, "I am the truth," in the spiritual realm. And in science, the whole point of science is to establish the truth about reality and how things work and so on. And there's a logical principle that truth cannot contradict truth. There may be some paradox, there may be some complications, but when you look into it in depth, there cannot really be a serious discrepancy between science and Christianity, because both are aspects of the truth.
That of course assumes that your knowledge, that your audience there and our college students aren't postmodern relativists, and that they actually think that truth is either exists or is not your truth or their truth.
That's another big problem in its own right.
Yeah, that's a problem for science.
I think evil,
a problem for the church as well.
I think the concept of evil is actually more prevalent than truth. Good and evil. They talk more about that than they do about truth.
That's true.
Good and evil is very subjective so far as most people are concerned, whereas truth is objective. It makes it a bit difficult to try and preach objective truth when people are only interested in subjective feelings.
Yeah,
well,
but
I don't think it's that.
yeah.
I don't think it's that simple as what you know. There's objective and subjective, because when it comes to evil, if someone might think, well, so much suffering in our world that if God does exist, He's not worthy of our worship. I mean, even if it is subjective, it's still a real something that's really an obstacle to belief in God.
Yep, it is genuinely a problem for a lot of
Just calling
people.
it subjective, it doesn't really resolve anything.
Well, one point with that, though, is if there is no God, then good and evil are pointless concepps.
Well, that's part of the reality of the world we live in. You could argue that if there's no God, it only becomes more problematic from theist point of view as to why it exists in such terrible. I mean, the degree of suffering that some people go through is just horrific.
I have read a number of books on the subject to go into great detail, and all of them that are any good can explain a lot of it and do a lot of it aside, and they all end up by saying that there are certain things that we just do not know, we just cannot explain. But we come back to things like the statement of Abraham in the Bible, shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And various things that we can learn about God, and we can from that trust that he is good, whether we can see it or not at the moment, because of other...
That might take a great deal of faith for some people to believe that.
Yeah, it also takes a whole lot more than just me saying something like that, because those few words that I just used then don't go anywhere near towards making that point. It's quite a large subject in its own right.
Absolutely.
It's not easily addressed.
Yeah, and I mean, there's some apologists who have spoken really well on this. I think Ravi Zacharias is one.
Yeah.
Who's addressed this issue around that idea around free will and being able to actually have a sort of universe where free will is possible means that you're going to have the ability for suffering as well as good, and that's also the only kind of universe where something like love can actually exist, because you can't put a gun to someone's head and tell them to love you. There needs to be a degree of free will in there. And that's when you get into things like the fall and those sorts of issues as well.
But free will can't explain all evil. There's a lot of natural evil
that
occurs that's extremely brutal,
absolutely,
which has nothing to do with human freedom.
Well, it sort of is, because it's tied to the fall and with Adam and all those sorts of things. But there's also that story of that there's a young girl in, I think it's the United States, who has a condition where she can't feel pain. And it's actually a really dangerous situation, because she has to be completely inspected at the end of every day, because they don't know whether she's stepped on something, or has had some sort of injury happen to her. So there is a purpose to some pain, and I think obviously Dr. Zacharias can explain this a lot better than I can. But it's not quite as simple as people think, and sometimes it's worth giving people these things to think about. Perhaps if I can try and dig up a couple of clips on it and send them through as links, because he'll be able to do a much better job than me. But it's not quite that black and white, as in all suffering is bad.
I never suggested all suffering is bad. Sometimes there's purpose in suffering, but it's difficult. I'm not saying these are impossible arguments.
I struggle with
they
it
are
as well.
significant obstacles, nevertheless.
Yeah, I agree.
It is impossible to understand it. I mean, it comes down to this age-old argument: how does a loving God allow terrible things to happen to good people? And it's kind of hinted at in the Book of Job. The Book of Job goes through all these terrible things that happens to Job, and then there's long, tedious arguments one way and another. At the end of the day, right at the end of the book, God turns up and says, basically, who the hell are you? You don't know anything. You don't have my perspective. You cannot understand because you do not have my perspective. I am the one who sees and doesn't have control of everything. And that's very difficult, particularly for scientists who like to have a concrete answer. That's not a satisfactory answer. But from a spiritual point of view, I think the closer you are to God, the more you can see, yes, God is in control, and God can make good things come out of terrible situations. But the natural man just doesn't see that, and cannot see that, because it requires, I think, some sort of spiritual perception.
And even within the book of Job, like all of Job's friends and Job himself, they never really discussed Satan. It doesn't really appear that they had a revelation of a satanic entity or a kind of spiritual demonic realm as is kind of revealed in the New Testament.
A lot of the argumentation in Job is very unsatisfactory.
Yeah,
I agree.
But like, I guess in the first kind of like 2 chapters of Job, it speaks about Satan, and Satan being this entity who is up to mischief and a destructive, malevolent force in the world. And I guess as I read the New Testament, and that seems to have a lot more information about Satan and a lot more kind of dialogue with Satan and demons, that seems to fill in a lot of the blanks of the whys behind evil. For me, I find that I understand certain. I think it has a lot of explanatory power, I guess.
May I just say the one thing I think that we're missing here, and it comes out in Jesus's parable of the rich man and in the bosom, and then the poor man who laid his gate, is there is this life, but then there is eternity stretching beyond it. We seem so focused in our worldly vision only on this life. That parable seems to say beyond that, God has a plan to take care of it. And perhaps, and I don't want to place too much emphasis on that message, that God is certainly knows what happens on this earth, and those that have suffered greatly on this earth may well be taken and compensated in the second life. Jesus himself reminds us, we're not to fear the first death. The first death is something, yes, it's going to happen. It may be painful, but it's the second death. The judgment day, let's be honest there, the judgment day, that is the death that we are truly to fear. God has got things in control, and it does extend beyond our 70 years and 10 that we spend on this earth.
Yeah, excellent point.
So Brian,
Yes.
what, relating this back to what you've been telling us about, how does the God of the gaps and the diminishing God of the gaps, shouldn't we be applying that to the problem of evil? I mean, you know, if science has proved that God is diminishing, then what does science say about providing an explanation for the problem of evil?
I think Richard Dawkins has probably given the best answer to that one. I can remember the quote, something about that in the universe there is no such thing as good and evil, just blind, pitiless indifference. And that is the perspective.
But people are very reticent to accept that. They want to have their cake and eat it too. I'm just wondering, given what you've said tonight, if there's a further critique we should do there, bearing in mind what Dawkins said. Yeah, exactly. But what hope is there for science? You know, if it's a science of the gaps, right?
Yep.
What is science of the gap? What does science one day hope to prove without jettisoning meaning? Which, by the way, I think it does. I agree with you. But is there a discussion? Is there an argument there that basically says we should critique and we should look at, and what could we reasonably steelman from a conversation about what science may one do? Well, except maybe eliminate all pain. Is that possible? Is that what the science of the gap says there? We're going to eliminate all suffering and evil? Seems far-fetched, right?
Well, Thomas, is the argument from evil ultimately a gap argument? That's saying, well, you could say that we currently don't know, but one day we'll find out. In terms of that there isn't an answer to the suffering, but you could say, but by saying that we cannot explain the evil, therefore God is not good or does not exist. Isn't that ultimately a gap argument as well?
I'm not following you, Kevin. I was asking, is there based on what Brian said, is there a science of the gaps argument here and a really big gap? Unless you jettison meaning. I mean, science has got a great, if you throw out meaning, that's fine. But most people are really reluctant to do that.
Yep. we can't live without meaning, and yet science, if it goes the way it's going and gets rid of all the gaps and just leaves you with science, has no meaning, no purpose.
But how do you critique that with respect to the problem of evil? Just seems you've just raised a really, really interesting prospect in my mind, Brian, because it seems to me we spend so much time defending our faith, we should be applying the secular logic back to the secular arguments. And you've said a science of the gaps. I think that's quite right. But what does that say about the problem that people have raised? And it's absolutely a stumbling block for our society and our culture. It hasn't always been so, of course. But what does a science of the gaps say about evil and suffering? Or forget evil, just about suffering. Even if the transhumanists are right and we live forever, really, without suffering, what does that look like?
From their perspective, I can't think of a good answer, and I don't think there is a good answer.
I don't think science really addresses that.
It ignores that.
But can't we press that? Shouldn't we be pressing that? It just seems to me there's an argument here to press to show that science is woefully inadequate to do that. Maybe highlighting our point that there's a science of the gap, or highlighting your point of the existence of a science of the gaps. I mean, just saying science of the gaps, people go, yeah, we'll solve everything. The transhumanists are looking, and even today, there's amazing experiments with aging, anti-aging, that have come out of one of the US, unis in the US. So, but suffering? How does science even address suffering? Apart from to eliminate it, can it eliminate it entirely? What would that look like?
At this stage, it would look like drugs. So you get put in a state where you don't feel anything and you're not really there.
And you divorce yourself from reality. That's a really good point, isn't it? Because that's exactly the scientific claim from us, that we're not basing ourselves in reality if you're a theist. I think you've just sown a lot of seeds in my mind. Thank you very much.
I'll grow them and see what comes.
Right, any more questions or comments? Oh, by the way, Rodney, you kind of raised the problem of evil. Have you got a take on it yourself?
I think it's a multifaceted problem. I don't think like I could give you like a simple answer that's going to explain it all. There's many different theories about the problem of evil. John Hick, a philosophy professor, I don't know if you're familiar with him or not.
A little.
He's written a number of different books, and he talks about the problem of evil, and obviously there's the classical views of the problem of evil, free will defense. There's also a process view of evil, which I'm not very satisfied with, but it's the argument that God is not omnipotent and that God is doing the best that God is able to do in our world. He really doesn't have any sort of, God doesn't really have any sort of unilateral capacity to act. I think probably what bothers me most is natural evil. Just look at the natural world and how brutal it is. Now, I know from a biblical perspective, you could probably argue that natural evil is as a consequence of the fall. It wasn't part of God's original creation, but that still makes God the author of that suffering. In a sense, it's very harsh. I admit there are difficulties, which I don't have perfect answers to.
But isn't it the case that in order for God to achieve his purpose, there must be a world which is morally neutral?
Yeah, but it's not. But see, natural evil is not about strictly a world of choice and of freedom.
What exactly makes it evil?
Natural evil is just the way the world acts. The devastation of, say, earthquakes and tsunamis, tornadoes, they're very brutal forces of nature.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised earthquakes, because I remember Professor Lennox answered this question and said the reason why people suffer from earthquakes is because they build houses on earthquake lines. And then he went and proceeded to talk about how important plate tectonics was to actually creating our stable atmosphere and the oxygen that we need that it creates, and that we need our plates to move on a planet Earth, or it just wouldn't be able to sustain life at all.
Well,
So again, you know, it's not black and white. Even with natural evil, some of the things that we suffer from are actually necessary processes to allow for beauty and love and all sorts of other things. So,
well, it's still troublesome.
I
definitely don't disagree. I'm just trying to say it's not black and white, because, you know, taking earthquakes is a perfect example of that.
Okay, but an earthquake isn't intrinsically evil. It's an
Well, the suffering. Well, but it's not.
And bad things occur from it. But evil, in the biblical sense, is a sort of it comes of volition. It's intended.
It has a moral aspect.
Yeah, it's a moral aspect. Whereas,
well, but yeah, if you're doing from say an atheistic perspective, it's not really a philosophical problem, because you could simply argue it's just the way the world is. You know, it's just the way it's developed. It's not evil as such. It's just the way the world is. But as soon as you introduce the idea of a good God, it does create some sense of a problem.
Could I suggest that the moment you have a purpose and a goal for existence, that problem arises?
Well, there is a certain degree of tension, no doubt, between belief in a good God and the degree of suffering in our natural world, and how brutal our natural world is. Animal, you know, the tooth and claw sort of argument.
Yes.
So often used. It's very brutal. You watch some of those animal movies, and the brutality of one animal towards another is terrible.
But why brutal? You have a goal in mind. You have a lack of something in mind.
Just because you have a goal in mind, I mean, you can have a brutal goal.
Well, who's to judge it? Who says it's brutal? Who says?
Well, it's very okay. Well, you can dismiss it by doing that sort of thing, but it does create. All I'm saying, it creates a certain degree of tension with belief in a good God.
I'm not saying, I'm not being dismissive whatsoever. I'm saying the moment you have a goal, and we had a lot of discussions around this with AI. If an AI took the whole planet captive and made us slaves, think sort of the Matrix, who is there to say there's something wrong with that? I mean, after all, it's more intelligent than we are, so it's if it's Steven Pinker, it's a higher life form. So who would we be to argue? I mean, who says? I'm not being flippant. I'm actually saying you've got some goals in mind to have judged something as brutal. On what objective standards?
Okay, but let's say, for example, a pack of wild dogs killed your young son or daughter in the most brutal of fashions, and you couldn't do a thing about it. Would you? You might say the animal's just doing what it does, but would you feel a certain sense of injustice or anger about it?
Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
I can tell you that's more than theory in my case. And my biggest exploration of atheism was actually with my son lying in ICU, and I realised that actually if we're just biology, and it's just evolution without a goal for life, without a goal for existence, then actually it really didn't make any difference in history, in the cosmos, anything except the synapses in my brain, whether he lived or died. And that's what I'm getting about with purpose. You're judging the brutality of it. I judged the suffering as bad, but I had to have a standard, and I had to have a goal or a purpose in mind. And then I realized, just what Brian was saying here, is that if Dawkins is right, if at the end there is no good, no bad, there's only DNA and we dance to its music, then that's perfectly intellectually consistent. But I had to admit to myself that it didn't really matter whether my son lived or died. Same as the son by the dogs or anybody in a tsunami or whatever. If there's a goal, then you can judge good and bad against that goal. If there's no goal, good and bad don't exist. Suffering is an illusion.
I wouldn't say it's an illusion.
As you were speaking on...
It may not have an ultimate purpose, but I would say it's an illusion. People really do suffer.
I mean, as you were speaking on like wild animals just now, I kind of was brought to mind the verse from Isaiah 11:6. The wolf will lie down with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion together. Kind of speaking of a future time of kind of freedom from violence and freedom from death and freedom from suffering. So it's kind of to view the current state of things as not the permanent state of the way things will perpetually be. And also not any kind of brutality or violence as not even being the originally intended state or like the Edenic design that God initially created.
That's a really good point. It's funny, you must be a much better person than me, because I can tell you what elicited from my mind was that Seinfeld bit where he says that you always go for the animal that's the subject of the episode. You know, if it's following the deer, you're like, oh, you know, get away from the lion. And then the next week it's the lion's episode. So you're like, oh, don't let him get away. You've got a family to feed.
Yeah.
Yeah, the thing with evil, it's only a problem if there is a good God. If there is no God at all, then as we've said, then it's all illusion. It doesn't mean a thing, no purpose, no anything. Just blind pitiless indifference, again, to quote Dawkins. If God is bad, then, well, it's just the natural outworking of who God is. It is only an issue if there is a good God. And so if it is an issue, that is evidence that God is good. It's very difficult to work through. It takes quite a bit of unpacking to get that properly. But it can only be an issue if we have a good God.
Mm.
Yeah.
Interesting point.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm satisfied with that. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah, but like if there's no such thing as a good God, then there's no problem of evil. It's just the way the world is. So, but if there is a good God, then you potentially have a contradiction at stake. So it becomes a problem if the good God does exist.
But if there is a good God, then there has to be a good explanation for it that we will be satisfied with when we find out.
Mm.
I'm happy with that, but it's probably difficult to prove it to others.
Yes, that's why I'm a little bit hesitant on it.
I find Dr. Hugh Ross's explanation of natural evil better than others that I've heard. And that's really taking a step back at the history of the planet and the universe, I suppose, and actually realising that the Earth is in the best, we're living at the best time, like as far as the sun's position and radiation and flaring ability. We're living at the best tectonic plate time in history. We're living at the time when we have fewer earthquakes. We're basically, if you want to look at every single natural evil, or a natural phenomena that we would classify having evil consequences, every single one of them, the earth is standing positioned right now in the last probably 8 to 10 or 8,000 years at the best possible time for humans' existence to try and limit the amount of death and destruction. So yeah, his book Improbable Planet is a really good one to read, and you can ask him yourself exactly these questions when he comes on in a few weeks. So yeah,
I better tee that up then, hadn't I?
yeah. You better.
Just a very irrelevant comment here. It's great to see all of us working here at night, but I can see daylight in the back of Gordon in the room behind. There you go.
That's not daylight, that's just a bright light.
Actually, I recommend this book. It's called The Problem of Evil, Selected Readings by a professor in philosophy from Asbury College, I believe he is. That's in the US. He presents a number of different readings from a number of different perspectives in there. It's quite an interesting book.
If you think it's worthwhile, can you just give us the name and author in the chat, please?
Well, it's an editor with numerous authors in it. It's called The Problem of Evil, Selected Readings by Michael Peterson, the editor. So it's quite an interesting book. I've collected quite a few books on that subject, so it's a topic of considerable interest to me.
I posted Tim Keller's recent questioning Christianity in the chat. I posted a link to that. He deals with COVID-19, and what he does sort of, I won't say an impartial survey of the resources, but I think he does a fair survey of the major worldviews resources for the problem of for suffering. More a practical guide than a theoretical guide, but of course it touches on what we've been talking about here as well, out of necessity. Anyway, I found it extremely practical.
And what about that whole idea? Does anyone know much about that idea of, and I think it comes from Ecclesiastes and maybe some of the Psalms around, things having their time and dying, and in order to bring us to where we need to be, that idea that obviously fossil fuels are essentially death of animals and plants and things like that is leading us to, the technological advances we have now in order to get the gospel spread out to everyone. Has anyone got any information around that idea or that concept? Has anyone heard of that before?
Just a comment on Ecclesiastes. I mean, it goes on about vanity, all is vanity and a striving after the wind, and it gives this sort of doom and gloom stuff. But what it is, when you read on, is trying to give a perspective that yes, here and now in the world, it's all short term. We just live short, brutal lives, and then we're gone. But the real reality comes later. It comes afterwards. It's the kingdom of God that follows on. And it's just drawing this contrast between short-term, not so good now, and eternal, brilliant later on.
Yeah, I think I'd be very careful trying to read too much other than the plain statement that Solomon apparently was writing, that there is futility in the world as he observed it without any faith. Yeah. And I think that's the major emphasis he's trying to get through. If you try and read too much into some of the other verses there and extend them.
I agree. I agree. The emphasis there is from Solomon's perspective, 1000 BC or whatever it was. But as you read on through the prophets and then the New Testament, then you put it all together and you see there's this wonderful perspective of here and now, not so important, God's perspective later on hugely important, and we really focus on the unimportant.
We do, yes.
All right, I think we might wind it up now. So personally, I thought your talk was very well put together, Brian. And so I think you made your point very well.
Okay.
And that point, yeah. And to me, that point is that we understand God through what we do know rather than what we don't. Yeah, so that was very good. So what I'll do is I'll stop the recording, and so you can feel free to discuss whatever you like, socialise, and so it's no longer censored. All right, I'll stop the recording for now for the sake of YouTube.